not that was, again, a well thought through goal. It certainly originally that was the explicit goal. So there was an ideological aspect to it. I struggle to find the ideological aspect to what the Chinese are doing. I really do.
I would say that under Mao Zedong in 1949, when he defeated Chiang Kai-shek in the nationalist forces, and yeah, Marin's right, Mao did kill far more people than Hitler did.
So did
or
Stalin.
The Nazis did. Although I'm going to ask the same question about Hitler as I did about Stalin in reference to Mao. When you have dictatorships of these things, they become monsters of their own creation, and they start to consume everything around them. And first, it's noble, right? They want the workers of the world to unite. They want, or it seems noble. They paint it as noble on the surface. There's nothing noble about it. But they spread this lie that they care about the common man. And yet, who's the first one to be subjugated by these thugs? It's always the little guy. It's always the common man who bears the brunt. Hitler wanted the same thing that Joseph Stalin wanted, that Mao Zedong wanted. They want control of everything, everywhere, all the time. And that part hasn't changed. Now, they have become far more sophisticated about it. They've learned their lessons from the times they tried it militarily in the 30s and 40s and into the 50s. But now the Chinese feel empowered because so much of the world they're in bed with economically that they have the ability to increase their military to a point where they become the big kid on the block and knock the United States off the mountaintop and begin to dictate to the rest of the world how things are going to be done. And I think that's what this end game you're talking about is. It's they want all of it. No matter how you define it, that's what they want. And they're willing to play the long game to get it. This plan of theirs that they're putting in, and I'm just surmising here, just knowing what I know about communism, they've been planning this for, 40, 50 years. And they've been working on sub-plans to lay the foundation for this since then.
Well, that's an interesting theory, and I
it
agree.
It is a theory.
Well, sure, but it's. I think it's a better theory than man-made global warming. But
well, that's good to hear.
And I think that there's some. I think that what you're onto something for sure, and that is that you might start out with an explicit purpose. In other words, this is what I want to achieve. But eventually you become so entrapped, if you will, in the mechanism of pursuing power that it becomes a pursuit for its own sake, and you can't break out of it, and you're no longer really able to define what it is that you want to achieve. With the Soviet Union, again, Nick, going back to your example, I think there was a certain ambiguousness, but still a real goal, and that was world revolution. The liberation of the proletariat. Now, it was all a farce anyway. Okay, but there was an element of that, at least originally, for the Americans, for those of us living in the free world. We had a pretty strong purpose, if you will, in our continuing to keep our military strong, etc. Number one, to deter aggression, but particularly to deter communist aggression, a la Soviet Union. So, and you could see an element of, again, confusion as to what our end game is. What is our purpose? Since the fall of the Soviet Union, what is the mission of NATO? Now, there's a subject for a whole podcast segment right there. I don't want to get into that right now, Nick, but you could see that. But I've never really been able to perceive what it is that the Chinese want to achieve. And short of what you're saying, and that is that, they've just been pursuing power for so long that it becomes an end in and of itself. I mean, it could be that simple. It really could be that simple.
Well, that is the estimation. What I'm presenting, of course, is a very simplified version of a very complex story. You've got the Silk Road, you've got the deals in Africa, you've got all kinds of different things that play into this, influencing governments, foreign governments to be nicer to China in the public square, so that people's attitudes don't harden towards China like they're already doing. I mean, the story that we were talking about last week, I was just keeping an eye on the comments, and somebody said there's more of this coming. There's more of this kind of nonsense that's out there, and we need to just keep bringing it up until people finally say, okay, this Chinese government is not who we want to do business with, and then start electing people who agree with that stance. I think it's the single most important story as far as Canadians are concerned on the planet right now, is to deal with this and get a handle on it and get rid of anybody who thinks that being in bed with these people, and again, I'm making a clear distinction between Chinese individuals and the government that they have to suffer under. I know it's just, we have to find a way to come to grips with this, because if we don't, it's like sinking into quicksand. You deal with it if you step into quicksand, the best thing to do is deal with the problem right away. The longer you stand in it and just twist about, the faster you're going to end up smothered. And that's just what we're faced with. Now, in a very simplistic analogy.
Yeah. Now, one other point I'd like to raise on this subject, and that has to do with international trade. And one of the things that we were hearing for many years, Nick, was that the way to influence Chinese policy and, if you will, to mitigate the worst excesses of the Chinese government was to engage in trade, because then they're going to make rational economic decisions and for the sake of keeping those trade routes open. And, at the time when I was hearing this, I was saying, that sounds too easy to be true, that's simple. It sounds to me a little bit like a double-edged sword, and I think that that's what it's become. One of the reasons that we don't take stronger action in the West, I suspect, against the Chinese government is because we're afraid of hurting our own commercial interests in China, which have come about and are strong because we were pursuing greater trade relations, better trade relations with the Chinese, not just for economic benefit, but also because we felt that was one way of I don't want to say civilizing their behavior, but influencing their behavior and making them, more of a positive member of the community of nations. And so what we've done is we kind of trapped ourselves into the situation where we were first of all saying that's the stick we're going to use against them, okay? And in fact, what's happened is the opposite. It's the stick that they get to use against us.
Yeah, it is. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And the answer is, as painful as it would be, well, maybe not as painful as I'm thinking at first. Number one, why did companies go to China in the first place? Well, we drove them there through unrealistic environmental regulations, red tape, the cost of doing business through ever-increasing tax loads. Sooner or later, you just make China look so much easier. Cheap labor, no taxes. They would basically give away the land, and they wanted, in other words, they wanted companies to settle in China and to benefit the Chinese government, and it didn't matter what it took to get that done. And we didn't recognize the threat for what it was, and we simply got so caught up in protecting the environment. I'll use that as one example. There's all kinds of other regulatory problems that made it places like, let's say, Caterpillar down in Chatham, close its doors and move offshore. There's dozens of Canadian companies that either don't exist anymore or have fled the continent for greener pastures. We caused that because we allowed our governments to continue to impose more and more draconian laws on the people who lay the golden egg. And they don't realize that if you slip a noose around the goose's neck that lays that egg and you keep tightening, sooner or later you're not going to get any more eggs. And now we're paying that price. So the answer, at least as I see it, and I could be easily wrong about this, is loosen that noose, take it. I wouldn't quite go so far as take it off completely, but start getting rid of redundant and time-consuming things like environmental assessments that have already been done 4 or 5 times. Lower the corporate tax rate because corporations don't pay taxes anyway. So either cut it to the bone or eliminate it altogether, with the idea that companies who take advantage of that would pass their savings on to the public. And if they can't or don't, they should be expected to explain why not. There's all kinds of different things we can do if we want to, if we have the personal fortitude to demand that of our government. But you know what? I don't see much of that out there. People haven't really thought it through.
Okay, and with that, Nick, we're going to have to go for our final break for tonight. So if you're listening to the show live, we'll be back in a few minutes. If you're listening to the podcast, this is the end of part 3 of episode 137. Part 4 will be posted on Tuesday morning. So again, we'll be back soon here on the Nick and Joe Show on ThinkRadio.ca.